So in today's video we're going to be covering the topic of conscription inside Imperial Japan. I know it's a topic that isn't often talked about at all, and it's a shame, but it really does put context towards the fighting men that were involved in the Second Sino-Japanese War, in the Sino-Japanese War, and in the Pacific theatres, and in the Pacific theatres. So first we're going to talk about the base level of education for the average Japanese conscript. Now we're not going to go into the technical roles or into NCOs and officers in this video. We're going to cover them at a later date. So the base level for your average private conscript in the Japanese army would have just been the 6 years of mandatory primary education. This would have obviously varied, but people who were higher educated tended to get funneled into more of the technical positions than as your base infantry sections. So in Imperial Japan, every male between the ages of 17 and 40 were required to perform military service, required to serve in the Japanese army for up to 20 years, I believe. But it wasn't a single 20-year stint in the mainline armed forces. So firstly, on the 17th birthday and on their birthdays subsequently, they would report to the military for military evaluation, and that took form more along the lines of physical evaluation than educational evaluation. Educational evaluation was only really evaluated once the people were conscripted into it, so they were divided into A class, B class 1, B class 2, B class 3, I believe. Yeah. And then C class, D class, and F class. Now A class are your conscripts which are in ideal physical fitness and who are at the ideal height that the Japanese army required for, which was 1.52 meters. Then your B class were ones which were not at that height but were still physically fit, and then your B class 2 were physically fit but or not quite as physically fit, and maybe have an eyesight or hearing problems. And then your B class 2 were the same but maybe to a more extended degree, so had worse eyesight or worse hearing, or weren't quite as physically fit. So what would happen is your A class, as many people that the armed forces required for that year, or would have been directly drawn immediately from the A class from doing it. Probably the same with the B class. So that varied to different extents throughout the period. So obviously less so in the beginning, and then as the war went on and they started, and needed more manpower, it pretty much claimed everybody in the A class would have just probably been taken. Now, everybody was required to do military service. So when you were conscripted, it would have been for 2 years of military service. But they had two organisations in the Japanese army. You had the armed forces properly, you had the reserve, and then you had the National Army 1 and the National Army 2. Now, everybody would have served in the National Army, depending on it. So A and B class, if you weren't recruited directly to the Japanese army, you would have been put into either the reserve army, where you would have had been called up for periods up to 100 days of military training, and you would have been used as replacements. So when units needed replacements, you'd been taken maybe for a further training and then sent on. If not, you would have been given, and then you'd have been put into the National Army. Now the National Army service life lasted for 20 years in both National Army. So you have the First National Army and the Second National Army. The First National Army was mainly made up of people who were in the A and B class of physical fitness but had not yet been called up, and they would have received military training. Alongside them, you would have had the people who had retired from the army. I've done their 2 years of service and then left the armed forces, and they would be made up into it. You stayed in the First National Army for 20 years or until you reached the age of 40. Then you had the Second National Army. The Second National Army was seen as a emergency defence force, and they received limited to no military training, and again you stayed in them until you reached for either 20 years or till you reached the age of 40, mainly to reach the age of 40. So I'll put a diagram up on the screen explaining that more. Now you had your C class was people who were not physically fit for military training, and they were put into the Second National Army, and again they served for 20 years or until they reached the age of 40. They were given no military training, now no military training at all, but they still had to, I believe they still had to report for a annual military readiness parade muster, where the First National Army, when that happened, they would actively form, they would come form into their units, into their regiments, etc., and normally undertake some form of military training or drill, and practice, do all that sort of stuff. Now the First National Army was also used to furnish replacements as the war progressed, and that was one of its functions. So quite often you'll have people who have served in the 30s and retired and be in the National Army during the Pacific War period, or and they would have then been sorry about that, the video cut out there. Anyway, so yeah, the First National Army acting as a reserve force. So yeah, quite often like I said, you get people who served in the 30s who had done their 2 year, or people who had done their 2 years, came out of the armed forces, were in the First National Army, and then recruited back into the Imperial Army as the war progressed. So do you want to talk about the last two classes, the D class and the F class, I believe? Yeah, D class and F class. D class was people who had physical ailments and could improve with treatment. These people were in the, I believe these people were exempt from military service but were still regularly assessed. So if their condition improved and recovered from their condition, they would then be put into the C class, and then they would be joining the Second National Army. Then finally you had your F class. F class were people who were physically disabled, and they were not required to do any form of military service, all the way up then until 45, where things got desperate and they were preparing to defend the home islands, and in that case everybody, no matter the physical disposition, was required to defend the home islands and the emperor. Thank God never had to invade the Japanese main islands. So anyway, that is the end of the video about our discussion about the Japanese conscription. I'll be doing later videos about NCO and officer training and recruitment and where they came from, and etc. So I hope you learned something from that, and I don't think I made any mistakes in that video. If you do find any mistakes per normal, point them out in the comments. So that is the Japanese conscription system.